The morning Elias Thatcher first lost an argument to Winifred Garner on purpose, he did not realize he had done it on purpose at all. It was the first week of April, 1879, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat at the very edge of civilization, perched like a hawk on a fence post between the cultivated east and the wild, breathing prairie that rolled westward without apology. The cattle trails still churned up the main street every season, drovers and cowboys pushing longhorns north from Texas, and the air always carried the mingled scent of dust and horse and possibility. Caldwell was a town that could not make up its mind about what it wanted to be, rough enough to have 2 saloons and a marshal who wore his badge at a slight angle, and just civilized enough to have a schoolhouse, a church with a real bell, and a general store that stocked fabric from back east. Elias Thatcher ran the livery stable at the south end of town, which meant he was usually the first man to meet the strangers coming in and the last to watch them leave. He was 29 years old, lean but not thin, built the way a man gets built when he works with his hands every day without thinking much about it. He had dark brown hair that needed cutting about 2 weeks more often than he ever got around to cutting it, and eyes the color of weathered oak, not quite brown, not quite green. Something in between that changed depending on the light and his mood. He had a reputation in Caldwell for being fair, steady, and almost infuriatingly calm. Men trusted him with their horses, which meant men trusted him with things they cared about, which in the West in 1879 was about the highest compliment you could hand a person. Winifred Garner had arrived in Caldwell 8 weeks before that April morning, riding in on the afternoon stage from Wichita with 2 trunks, a leather satchel that she kept with both hands, and an expression that said she had made this decision herself, "Thank you very much," and would not be entertaining second thoughts. She was 26, which in 1879 meant she was what polite society would have called a woman who'd had time to form opinions, and what the women of Caldwell's sewing circle would have called a woman who'd had time to get particular. She had auburn hair she wore pinned up but which never seemed to stay entirely pinned, wide gray eyes that noticed things before she said anything about them, and a mouth that moved fast when she had something to say, which was often. She had come to Caldwell to take over the schoolteacher position vacated by old Mr. Hobbs, who had retired to Wichita to live with his daughter. The town board had hired her on the strength of her qualifications from a teacher's college in Ohio, and a letter of reference from a minister that called her morally upstanding and intellectually vigorous, both of which turned out to be accurate. The children of Caldwell adored her within 2 weeks, which was notable because children are the most honest judges of character in any century. Elias had met her properly on a Wednesday morning when she came to the livery to arrange board for her horse, a brown and white paint mare she called Juniper. He had been expecting someone older. The hiring notice had described the new teacher in formal enough language that he'd pictured a woman in her 40s, sensible shoes and spectacles. What he got was Winifred Garner in a dark green riding coat, her hair doing its usual escaping act from the pins, leading a mare with the easy confidence of someone who had been around horses her whole life and knew it. She had looked at his stalls, at his water troughs, at the way his hay was stored, and she had asked specific questions, not the sort of questions a person asks to fill silence, but the sort of questions that come from actually wanting to know the answers. Then she told him what she expected for Juniper's care, what the mare would and would not eat, that she was particular about how her hooves were picked before a ride, and that she had a small scar on her left flank that looked worse than it was but would still need to be checked weekly. Elias had agreed to all of it with a nod, quoted her a fair price, and then she'd held out her hand to shake on it the way a man would, which had caught him off guard for just a moment before he shook it. "Miss Garner," he'd said. "Mr. Thatcher," she'd said back, and there had been something in the way she said his name, not flirtatious, not formal either, just direct, that had stayed with him for the rest of the afternoon in a way he couldn't quite account for. The argument that first Tuesday in April was about water rights. Caldwell's mayor, a wide man named Herbert Colton who wore his authority like a coat he'd outgrown, had floated the idea at the previous Monday's town meeting of diverting a portion of Bluebell Creek for a new irrigation channel that would primarily benefit the Colton family's grain operation at the edge of town. Elias had been at the meeting. He'd sat in the back, as he usually did, listening. He had concerns, but he kept them organized and quiet, the way he kept most things. Winifred had been at the meeting too, sitting 2 rows ahead of him, and she had not been quiet. She had stood up, in front of the mayor and the entire assembled town, and laid out calmly, but with an edge that could cut leather, exactly why the diversion would affect the water supply to 3 families on the east side of town, 2 of whom were farming families who could not afford a dry season, and one of whom was the widow Calloway who had 4 children and a well that already ran low by August. She had cited the rainfall measurements from the last 3 years, which she had apparently gone and looked up from the county records. She had named the families by name. She had looked Herbert Colton directly in the eye while she did it. The mayor had blustered, and the meeting had ended without a vote being called. The next morning, Elias came in early to begin work, and Winifred arrived at the livery to take Juniper out for her morning ride, and she found him already in the side paddock adjusting a fence rail that had come loose. She tied Juniper at the post and came around to where he was working. "You were at the meeting last night," she said. "I was," he agreed. "You didn't say anything." He tested the rail with his palm, found it solid. "You said enough for both of us." She tilted her head at that. "You disagreed with the mayor's plan, though. I could tell. You had the look of a man holding his tongue." He glanced at her. "What does that look like?" "Like a man chewing on something he decided not to swallow yet." He almost smiled. "Accurate. Then why didn't you say anything? You've lived here longer than I have. People would have listened to you." He set down his hammer and turned to face her properly. He could have explained his reasoning, that he preferred to let things develop, that he'd planned to speak to the mayor privately, that he believed in choosing the right moment. All of that was true, but she was looking at him with those gray eyes that were waiting for something real, not something polished. "I thought you were doing fine on your own," he said, "and I was right." That was the first time he saw it, the way her expression when she changed something in her face. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't even satisfaction, exactly. It was more like the particular brightness that lives in a person when the world has just confirmed, briefly, that they are not wrong about who they are. A kind of radiant relief. Her chin came up a half-inch, her shoulders settled back, and she smiled, not at him, almost at the air between them, and it was the most genuinely alive he had seen another person look in he couldn't recall how long. He went back to his work, but he was thinking about that smile for the rest of the morning, and he did not examine too carefully why. The second argument happened 4 days later. It was about the proper way to treat a horse with a stone bruise. Elias had been in the middle of treating old Cooper Hale's gelding when Winifred came in to check on Juniper, who'd picked up a small stone on the trail the day before. He'd already assessed Juniper and left her to rest, confident the bruise was minor, but when Winifred asked what treatment he was applying, he told her, and she said she'd heard that a different poultice was more effective, one her father's farmhand had used back in Ohio. He knew she was wrong. He had been treating stone bruises in horses since he was 16 years old, and the method she described was outdated, not harmful, just less effective than what he was using. He opened his mouth to say exactly this, and then she looked at him with that focused look she got when she was making a case, and she went on to describe what her father's farmhand had done and why it had worked, and she was so invested in it, so genuinely convinced, leaning against Juniper's stall door with her arms folded and her eyes bright. He said, "You know what, that does have merit. I'll keep that in mind for the next time." She beamed. Not a polite smile, a full, lit-up beam. "I thought so," she said, not unkindly, just sure of herself, and she went in to fuss over Juniper and the conversation moved on. He stood there for a moment after she turned away, and he knew perfectly well that the method he was using was better. He knew she was wrong, and he had let it go anyway, and the only honest reason he could identify for why he had done it was that he had wanted to see that look on her face again. He told himself it was just courtesy. He told himself it was because she was new in town and he didn't want to make her feel talked down to. He told himself it was polite. He picked up his tools and went back to work and did not think about it again, which was to say he thought about it quite a bit. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that Elias told himself was purely coincidental. Winifred came to the livery most mornings before school and sometimes in the early evenings. She had a habit of talking to Juniper in a low voice while she groomed her, and he had discovered, without meaning to, that if he was quiet and working nearby, he could sometimes hear what she said. Mostly it was practical things, what she needed to do that day, what the children had done in class that had made her laugh. Once she told Juniper that she was not sure she'd made the right decision in coming to Caldwell, but that it was still better than staying where everything was familiar and none of it was hers. He had not said anything about that, but he thought about it. She brought him coffee one Thursday morning in a tin cup, climbing up from town with it held carefully so it wouldn't spill, because she'd made a pot and had extra, and she said it seemed wasteful not to share. He thanked her. They stood in the morning light and drank their coffee and talked about the weather, which was building toward a proper Kansas spring thunderstorm. And she said she found thunderstorms thrilling rather than frightening, and he said the same. And they looked at each other across the rims of their cups with the kind of mild surprise that happens when you find something in common with someone you hadn't expected to have it with. The third argument, the one that began to make things complicated, happened on a Friday at the end of April. There was a dog. It was a scruffy, medium-sized brown dog of no identifiable breed that had appeared at the edge of the livery yard sometime around Wednesday and had been hanging around ever since. Elias had been feeding it scraps because he was not made of stone and the dog was thin, but he had not made any commitments. Winifred saw the dog on Friday morning and immediately named it something before even consulting him. "Walter," she said, holding her hand out for the dog to sniff. "He looks like a Walter." "He's not my dog," Elias said. "He's living at your livery." "That's his choice, not mine." "Elias," she looked up from where she'd crouched down to let Walter smell her properly. "You've been feeding him." He crossed his arms. "I've been keeping him from starving. That's different from ownership. Only in the very technical legal sense." She scratched Walter behind the ear and Walter turned toward her hand with the trusting, boneless pleasure of a dog that had been waiting for kindness. "He needs a proper collar and a name." "He has a name, apparently." She grinned at him over her shoulder. "You hate Walter." He did not hate Walter. He thought Walter was a reasonable name for a dog. He was going to say something more skeptical, and then she turned back to the dog and said, "Don't you worry, Walter, he just hasn't admitted it yet." And Walter looked up at her with complete devotion, and Elias looked at the two of them, the dog leaning against her knee, the woman laughing, the May morning light catching the red gold in her hair, and he let the argument go. "Fine," he said. "Walter." She turned back to him with that brightness, and it hit him, again, in the same place as before. And this time he recognized it for what it was and quickly, firmly, set it aside like a tool he was not prepared to use. He told himself he had agreed about the dog because there was no strong reason to disagree. That was all. Walter stayed. He turned out to be an excellent dog, even-tempered, sensible, good with the horses and with children, who came to the livery sometimes after school to visit him when Winifred had sent them home. Elias built him a proper little bed in the corner of the tack room and bought him a leather collar from the saddle maker down the street, a nice one, brown with a brass buckle, and did not think too hard about why he'd gotten the good collar instead of the plain one. It was the second week of May when it started to become impossible to ignore. He was shoeing a horse, the bay gelding belonging to a rancher named Prout who ran cattle east of town, and he was thinking, in the way that hands-busy work allows the mind to wander, about the week that had just passed. He was cataloging, without quite meaning to, the moments of it, and he realized with a slow, spreading clarity like water moving across flat ground, that he could locate in each day of the past several weeks at least one moment in which he and Winifred had disagreed about something, and he had, what was the honest word? Yielded, conceded, let her have it. Not every time, he noted quickly. There had been the matter of the broken wheel on the Caldwell schoolhouse cart, where she'd suggested a fix, and he'd told her straightforwardly that it wouldn't hold, and he'd been right, and she'd acknowledged it with graceful pragmatism that he'd admired. There had been a discussion about a book she'd lent him. She'd pressed Mary Shelley's Frankenstein on him one afternoon, saying he seemed like a man who would appreciate it, which he did. And they'd talked about it one evening on the livery fence and disagreed about the monster's nature, and neither had yielded an inch, and it had been one of the best conversations he could remember having. But in the smaller arguments, the daily ones, the name of the dog, the horse treatment, the question of whether the south paddock fence needed repainting this season or could wait until fall, he'd been letting her win. Not always because she was wrong. Sometimes she was right. But sometimes she was not entirely right, and he'd let it go anyway. And now, with his hands on this horse's hoof and the May wind moving through the stable, he made himself say plainly what he'd been dancing around for weeks. He let her win because he loved watching her win. He loved the way her chin lifted and her shoulders settled, and that brightness came into her face, that particular quality of being the most alive version of herself. And he had been engineering small moments of it like a man tending a garden, careful and deliberate, without even fully admitting to himself that he was doing it. He set down the horse's foot and straightened up and stood there in the middle of the stable, while Prout's gelding looked back at him with the mild curiosity of a horse that has seen men work through complicated feelings before. He was in love with Winifred Garner. He had been, he suspected, for a while. Probably from the Wednesday morning, she'd shaken his hand and said his name like she'd already decided what kind of person he was going to turn out to be and had good feelings about it. He picked up his tools and finished the job, and he was very methodical and precise about it, because methodical and precise was what he had. He was not a man who acted on things before he'd thought them through, and he needed to think this through, because Winifred Garner was also a woman who had an opinion about everything and would surely have an opinion about this. The trouble was that he did not know what her opinion was. She was warm with him, and direct, and clearly comfortable in his company in a way that had grown steadily since the first week. She came to the livery more than strictly necessary for Juniper's care. She'd taken to bringing coffee on Thursday mornings as a regular habit. She told him things about herself she didn't share in the general currency of town conversation. But she was also, he knew, a woman who was enormously careful about her own independence, who had come to Caldwell specifically to build something that was hers, and who might find the idea of a man having feelings for her to be an inconvenience rather than anything else. He thought about this for 3 days without saying anything, which meant 3 days of their usual mornings, their usual coffee, their usual easy arguments that he won some of and let her win others of, except now he was aware of what he was doing with the ones he let go, and he felt not ashamed of it exactly, but caught, like a man who's been keeping a secret he didn't realize he was keeping. On a Thursday evening in the 3rd week of May, Winifred came to the livery late, which was unusual. She arrived at dusk with her hair properly down for once, loose on her shoulders, which he'd never seen, and she looked like she'd been walking for a while. There was a particular settled quality to her that came from the kind of thinking that needs movement. She sat on the fence of the paddock while he finished his evening chores, and Walter installed himself at her feet with his chin on her boot. She was quiet longer than she usually was. He waited. "I had an interesting conversation with Margaret Colton today," she said eventually. Margaret was the mayor's wife, a sensible woman who was much better than her husband. She told me that Herbert is going to revive the water diversion proposal next week at the town meeting. He's gotten 2 of the board members on his side. Elias nodded. He'd heard the same. Clyde Barrow and Jesse Patterson, he said. Both of them owe Colton favors. I went back through the county records this afternoon. She reached into the pocket of her jacket and produced a folded paper, and even in the dimming light he could see she'd made meticulous notes. There is a clear precedent in Kansas state law against diverting water sources that serve multiple landowners without the consent of all parties. I found the statute. It's from 1874. He looked at her. She was holding the paper like a weapon. You're going to quote law at Herbert Colton, he said. I am going to quote law at the entire town meeting, she said. And then he can try to argue with the statute. He was quiet for a moment, looking at her in the evening light, the paper in her hand, Walter still devotedly occupying her feet. He thought about what he wanted to say, and then he thought about the fact that what he'd been doing for weeks was saying the soft version of things instead of the honest version, and he decided that was perhaps something that needed to stop in at least one direction. Winifred, he said. She looked up. I want to come with you, to the meeting, and speak. There was a pause. You don't have to, I can. I know you can. That's not why I want to. He leaned against the fence post near her, close enough that he could keep his voice low. You know Caldwell better than you're given credit for. You know those families by name and situation, and you've done your research and you're right about all of it. But the board members are going to sit there and look at you like you're a schoolteacher who doesn't understand the real workings of town, and that's going to make what you're saying harder to hear, and I do not think that's fair or right. She was watching him carefully. I've lived here 9 years, he continued. Those men have stood in my stable while their horses got seen to and talked to me the way men talk when they think they're just talking to the hired help, which means they've told me things. I know where their loyalties sit, and I know what arguments reach them. I think together we're harder to dismiss. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, carefully, Are you saying I need your help? He recognized the question for what it was. She was giving him a chance to get it wrong, and he was not going to get it wrong. No, he said. I'm saying I need to be useful to something I believe in, and I believe in this. The pause that followed was different from the earlier silences. Softer somehow. All right, she said, and the smile she gave him was quieter than her usual brightness, less triumphant and more something else that he couldn't name immediately but which settled warm in his chest. They prepared for the meeting together over the next several days. She came in the evenings after school had ended, and they sat in the tack room at the old work table with her notes and his knowledge of the town's particular social architecture, talking through who would need what argument, who would be swayed by legal precedent, and who would need to hear about the practical consequences, who would respond to numbers and who would respond to stories. Walter slept between their chairs. It was during these evenings that Elias began to understand how her mind worked, and it was, he discovered, extraordinary. She moved through problems with a combination of genuine rigor and instinct that he recognized in himself and rarely saw in others. She would follow an argument all the way out to its conclusion, then double back and check the assumptions, then come at it from the side just to see if it held. She caught things. She remembered details weeks after they'd been mentioned and brought them back at exactly the right moment. And she was funny, in a dry, quick way that crept up on him. She made observations about the social dynamics of Caldwell that were so precisely accurate they made him laugh out loud, which he didn't do often enough, and she seemed pleased by this without being smug about it. On Tuesday evening, 2 days before the meeting, they had finished going through everything and the papers were in order and the arguments were ready, and they were sitting in the comfortable quiet that had grown up between them over these weeks, drinking the last of a pot of coffee she'd brought over, and he thought, I am going to have to say something. Not tonight, necessarily, but soon. She said without looking up from a page she was rereading, Can I ask you something personal? You can ask, he said. She looked up. Why did you let me have the argument about the stone bruised poultice on Juniper? He went still. I looked it up, she said, and her voice was matter of fact, not accusatory. After that morning, I was curious, so I asked Doc Redfield about it. He said the method you were using was the more effective one. A pause. And I thought back to the fence boards. The south paddock. You said the old wood would do another season when I'd said it needed replacing, but I was right, it started splitting 2 weeks later. And the dog's name. He looked at her steadily. Winifred, you let me win, she said. On purpose, more than once. Her voice was not angry, it was searching. Why? He set his coffee cup down. He looked at the lamp on the workbench, then at her, and he decided with the sort of quiet, clear decision that good men make when they stop calculating and just choose honesty. Because I love watching you win, he said. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Walter seemed to pause his breathing. What? She said, barely above a whisper. The way your face looks when you've made your case and it holds. The way he stopped, chose his words carefully. There's a quality you have when you're sure of something. When you've reasoned it through and you know you're right, and I found that I was a pause. I was manufacturing reasons to see it. She was very still. That was not fair to you, he continued, keeping his voice even. You deserve honest disagreement. You're better than a man managing your feelings so he can watch you light up. I know that. I'm not making a case for having done it. He looked at the table. I just thought if you noticed it, which you clearly did, you deserved the honest answer. A very long moment passed. Elias, she said. He looked up. How long? He considered lying or minimizing. He did not do either. Since about the second week of April. Honestly, since the Wednesday you brought Juniper here and shook my hand. But I didn't realize the other thing, the arguments, until this month. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't read entirely, which was unusual because he'd gotten fairly good at reading her. There was something in it that was careful and something that was surprised and something that was. He did not let himself name what the third thing was, because he did not want to be wrong. I owe you honest arguments from here on out, he said. Whatever else, that much is just right. She stood up slowly from her chair, and his heart did something that he ignored. She walked around the table, and he turned on his stool to face her, and she stopped in front of him, and she studied his face with those gray eyes for what felt like a full minute. I have been coming to this livery more than Juniper strictly requires, she said. For the last 6 weeks. He waited. I have been finding reasons, she said carefully. Extra coffee, questions about the town that anyone could have answered. Concerns about Juniper's shoe she stopped. That were not always as serious as I made them. He looked at her. I think, she said, and her voice was very deliberate, like she was reading a statute at a town meeting, that I have also been doing something that I did not entirely admit to myself. He stood up slowly. They were close, in the lamplight of the tack room, and Walter lifted his head and then put it back down with the philosophical acceptance of a dog who understands that some human moments do not require canine involvement. Winifred, he said, are you making your case? I'm laying out the evidence, she said, and the brightness was coming into her face, not the triumphant kind, the other kind he'd seen on the fence post that evening a week ago, the softer version that was something just for him, and he thought, there it is. I accept the evidence, he said. She leaned up and he leaned down, and they met somewhere in the middle, which was appropriate for two people who were, it turned out, each more than halfway there already. It was a careful first kiss, honest and warm, no pretense in it, and when they pulled back she kept her eyes closed for a moment before she opened them. For the record, she said, and her voice was slightly different from usual, lower and breathing differently, and she was still very close. I was right about Walter. He laughed, and it was the real kind, the kind that surprised him out of himself, and she smiled at him with that full brightness and said, see, you agree with me. I do, he said. God help me, I almost always do. She looked at him very directly. Then argue with me sometimes, please, I mean it. I know you do, he said. I promise. The town meeting was on Thursday evening. The Grange Hall was full, more full than usual, which meant word had gotten around that there was going to be a real contest. Herbert Colton sat at the front table with Clyde Barrow and Jesse Patterson flanking him like deputies, and the rest of Caldwell arranged itself in the rows of chairs behind them. Elias came in with Winifred and they sat together, which several people noticed, and said nothing about aloud but clearly had opinions about. Colton laid out his proposal with the ease of a man who has prearranged the votes. He was smooth about it, citing benefit to the town's agricultural expansion, using words like progress and development in the way that certain men use them as shields against opposition. When he finished, Winifred stood. She thanked the mayor for his proposal. She said it in a way that sounded genuine and was not sarcastic, which was harder than sarcasm would have been and more effective. She said she understood the appeal of the plan for agricultural growth, and she wanted to make sure the board had the full picture before they voted. Then she laid out the water records. She named the families. She told the specific story of the widow Calloway's well, not sentimentally, but specifically, with the facts of how low it ran by August and what a further reduction would mean for 4 children. She cited the 1874 statute and read it directly from the paper, clearly and without rushing. Colton started to respond, talking over the part about the statute, saying that it didn't quite apply in this circumstance and that the board would need legal counsel to Elias stood. He did it quietly, which made it more attention-getting than a dramatic rise would have been. The hall settled. "Clyde," he said to Barrow, not to the mayor, "your family uses the same tributary as the Calloway well. Did you know that?" Clyde Barrow had not known that or had not remembered it. His face said so. "And Jesse?" He looked at Patterson. "The diversion runs about 40 yards from the north boundary of your property. If it holds through a dry August, you're fine. If it doesn't, your north pasture goes dry first." He said it without drama, just information. "I've been watching the water levels in that creek for 9 years. I know how she runs." The room was very quiet. "I'm not saying don't develop," Elias said. "I'm saying read Miss Garner's research before you vote, because she's right about what happens downstream." Colton tried to redirect, but the mood of the room had shifted in the way that rooms shift when 2 people have said the true thing clearly in the same direction. The vote did not happen that night. Colton asked for a committee to review the proposal, which meant it was effectively stalled, and in Caldwell in 1879, stalled meant dead. Walking back up the main street afterward, the night air warm and carrying the smell of new grass from the prairie, Winifred was quiet beside him. Walter had gotten loose from the livery and was trotting beside them, which was a habit he had developed that everyone had decided to accommodate. "That was well done," she said. "You'd already done the work," he said. "We did it together," she said, and looked at him sideways. "We did," he agreed. She reached over and took his hand, which neither of them had planned, and they walked the rest of the way back to the livery like that, with Walter trotting ahead and the stars coming out over the Kansas plain and the distant sound of a cattle drive somewhere south of town moving through the dark. The weeks that followed were, for Elias, like the experience of recognizing a language he'd been half hearing for years and now could fully understand. Everything sharpened. The mornings had always been good, and now they were the best part of his day. The coffee, the sound of her voice talking to Juniper, the arguments that were real now, both of them putting in their honest position, and the disagreements that came of it had a different quality than the manufactured ones had had. They were alive. She pushed back on him, called out the moments when he was being stubborn out of habit rather than reason, and he did the same for her. And the making up, the circling back, the moment when one of them acknowledged the other had the better point, all of it meant something different when it was genuine. They had arguments about things that mattered and things that did not matter at all, and both kinds were equally good. The genuine arguments he won sometimes and she won sometimes, and the ratio did not particularly favor either of them, and he told her this one morning and she said, "I know. I've been keeping track," which delighted him. June came, and with it the Kansas heat and the high blue sky and the buffalo grass going gold in the prairie beyond town, and the cattle drives that came through Caldwell in their season big trail, herds from Texas heading for the railheads, drovers who were young and mostly tired, a few seasoned hands who'd been doing it for years, and the occasional character who made things interesting. It was a drover from one of those trail herds who created the only real conflict of that whole bright summer. His name was Calhoun, and he was passing through Caldwell with a herd of 1,200 cattle and a crew of 8 men, and he needed to board 7 horses at the livery for 2 days while the cattle were penned at the stockyard. Elias took the horses, which was straightforward business. The trouble was that Calhoun also had ideas about Winifred. He'd seen her in town. She was not a woman you didn't notice. And he had made inquiries, and when he found that she was not married, he had decided that a woman alone in a western town was an opportunity for a charming trail hand with decent wages. He was not wrong about the charming part, technically. He was wrong about the opportunity part. He came to the livery the following morning while Elias was working and Winifred was there visiting Juniper before school, and he made his interest plain in the way that confident, somewhat careless men did in 1879, not threatening, but not leaving much room for a polite no to be heard either. He addressed himself primarily to Winifred, which she handled with the efficiency of a woman who had handled this category of situation before, giving him a clear and unreserved refusal that was polite but left no doors open. Calhoun accepted this with imperfect grace and shifted his attention to Elias, saying something to the effect that Elias was a lucky man, surely, which was its own kind of presumption, the assumption that the woman's refusal was on behalf of a man rather than herself. Winifred heard this and turned around. "I didn't refuse on his behalf," she said to Calhoun directly. "I refused on my own." Calhoun had looked between them, mildly uncomfortable for the first time, and then left. After he was gone, Elias expected her to be angry at Calhoun, at the presumption, at the general situation. She was, but the anger burned off quickly in the way that clean anger does when the situation has actually been handled. What she said afterward, leaning against Juniper's stall and looking at Elias with a slightly crooked smile, was, "You didn't say a word." "I didn't need to," he said. "Most men would have. Most men would have thought they needed to," he agreed. "You didn't need me to." She looked at him for a moment with something complicated and warm. "You know," she said, "I think that might be the thing." She started again. "You let me fight my own fights." "I do," he said. Even now, he confirmed. "I'll always be here. But I know the difference between being here and being in the way." She crossed the stable and kissed him with a decisiveness that was entirely her, and then said, against his jaw, "Most men don't." "I know," he said. "I had 9 years of watching the ones who didn't to figure out why it went wrong for them." The summer deepened and Caldwell went about its business and Elias went about his, and Winifred was in it the way a river gets into a landscape, not dramatically, just increasingly there, shaping things, until you can't remember what the land looked like before the water. He knew her routines and she knew his. She knew he drank his coffee black, and she made it that way on Thursdays without asking. He knew she hated mornings that started with administrative paperwork and brought extra wood shavings for Walter's bed on the days she had school board correspondence to manage, because that was the kind of day she'd need a good thing. These small fluencies accumulated. There were dinners at Nell Harper's boarding house, where Winifred had her room, because Nell had a table big enough for several people and she liked filling it, and the other residents. A dry goods salesman from St. Louis and a young surveyor mapping ranch boundaries for the county were good company, and there was good food, and Elias began going on Sundays as a regular thing. He and Winifred sat across from each other most of the time, which meant he had a good view of her when she was animated in conversation, which was frequently. He took her riding on Sunday afternoons when the schoolwork was done, and the week had given her everything it was going to give her. They went out into the prairie, which in July was alive with grass and sky, and the occasional hawk hanging in the thermals above them like a punctuation mark. She was a good writer. She'd said she'd grown up on a farm in Ohio, and it showed. She had a natural seat, and she was easy with Juniper, responsive without being rigid. He rode a gray mare he'd had for 3 years named Cornet, and the two horses had established their own friendship, which Winifred said was evidence of compatibility, and he said was evidence that horses were practical creatures, and she said that was the same thing, and he said it wasn't, and they argued about it pleasantly all the way back to town. He told her things he hadn't told many people. About his father, who'd been a decent man who'd worked himself to death on a Kentucky farm, and how Elias had moved west at 20 looking for something that had more room in it than the life he'd been handed. About the years he'd spent working other men's stables before saving enough to buy his own, the satisfaction of having something that was genuinely his, the way he'd built the livery edition himself over a long winter because hiring it out would have meant spending money he wanted to keep for the horses. She told him about her mother, who taught her to read and then handed her a stack of books and said that women needed to know things. They just weren't always allowed to show it. About the teachers' college in Ohio, where she'd been one of 12 women in the program, and they'd had to work twice as hard as the men to get the same marks, and how she'd not only accepted that but used the anger it generated as fuel. About why she'd chosen Caldwell specifically. She'd looked at several teaching positions and chosen the one that was furthest from everything familiar because she had a theory that growth required discomfort and she wanted to test it. Was the theory correct? He'd asked. She'd considered it seriously. Yes, she said, though I didn't account for all the variables. Such as the variables that were not on the map when I was making my calculations, she said, and looked at him in a way that made his chest tight with warmth. By August, he knew he was going to ask her to marry him. He knew this the way he knew solid things, not with urgency or drama, but with the quiet certainty of a man who has taken an honest accounting of himself and knows what he's found. He also knew that he was going to ask her in a way that left her completely free to refuse without consequence, because she needed to know that his asking was not pressure, only invitation. He worked out what he wanted to say, not by scripting it, but by knowing clearly what was true and trusting that the true things would find their own order when the moment came. There was a thing he needed to do first, though. He went to her at the livery on a Wednesday morning, their regular morning, when she was brushing out Juniper and singing something half under her breath that she stopped when she heard him come in, but not before he'd identified it as a church hymn. She'd adapted new words to. Something about August heat and contrary mayors, which was the kind of thing she did when she thought no one was listening. He leaned against the stall door and she looked at him. I've been letting you in on purpose for 6 weeks before I admitted it, he said, and then I told you I'd stop, and I have. And I want you to know that the arguments since then, the ones I've agreed with you on, are genuine. She raised an eyebrow. I know. I want to make sure you know, because what I'm about to say requires you to know that I'm not managing your feelings. She set down the brush and turned to face him properly, leaning against Juniper's side. Winifred, he said, I love you. Not in the way where I'd soften all the hard things to keep you comfortable. I know you better than to think that's what you want. I love you the way that means I want to argue with you honestly for the rest of my life, and have you beat me sometimes and beat you sometimes, and build something with you that neither of us could build alone. She was very still. I'm asking you to marry me, he said, and I need you to know that the only answer that matters is the honest one. I would rather you say no than yes because you felt obligated or because the situation made it complicated to say anything else. You have never in your life given me anything but your honest opinion, and I would not have it different now. She was quiet for a moment that he let be what it was. Then she said, You practice that. I thought about it, he said. There's a difference. What's the difference? Practiced means you're managing the outcome. Thinking means you're making sure you're saying the right thing. She looked at him for another long moment and then she said, Elias, you ridiculous, careful, honest man. and she crossed to him and put her hands on either side of his face and looked at him from very close, and she said, "Yes, obviously yes. It was always going to be yes." He kissed her, and Juniper nosed at both of them with the mild territorial interest of a horse whose personal space has been encroached upon. And Walter, who had trotted in at some point during the preceding conversation with his characteristic impeccable timing, barked once and then sat down with evident satisfaction. They were married on the 4th Saturday of September, 1879, at the Caldwell church, and it was a real wedding with most of the town present, which turned out to mean most of the town wanted to come, which said something about how people had been watching the two of them all summer and drawing their own conclusions. Nell Harper organized the food because Nell organized anything that needed organizing and did it well. The children of Winifred's school class made a banner that said "Congratulations, Miss Garner and Mr. Thatcher" in large uneven letters, and Winifred cried a little at it, which she did not apologize for. She kept teaching after the wedding, which in 1879 was not common, but which she had discussed with the school board clearly before the ceremony. The board had attempted once to suggest that a married woman in the schoolroom was perhaps not the usual arrangement, and Winifred had produced 2 legal precedents and a letter from the county superintendent, who had told her privately that her students' reading levels had improved significantly since her arrival, and the board had found they had no actual objection when it came down to it. Elias had been there when she'd made her case to the board, and he had contributed exactly 2 sentences, both of which were specific factual points she'd asked him to have ready, and the rest of it was entirely her. And when they came out of the meeting and she turned to him with that full brightness, the one he'd been cataloging since April, he thought, there it is. He would never stop being glad to see it. They moved into the house Elias had built at the back of the livery property, which was larger than he'd ever strictly needed when it was just him, and which now made sense. She brought her 2 trunks and her satchel and her books, rather more books than he'd anticipated, and her very clear opinions about where things should go, and he contributed the space and the willingness to rearrange furniture twice, which was his limit and she agreed was reasonable. They argued about the furniture. She won about the table. She was right that it needed to be near the east window for the morning light, and he won about the arrangement of the sleeping room, because he'd lived with the particular slant of that floor for 3 years and knew the furniture needed to be placed to account for it, and she said she would take his word for it and did. Walter slept by the stove in the main room on a proper bed that was neither of them had needed to discuss. It was simply where the bed went. The autumn that followed was the best Elias could recall, and he had had some good autumns. The prairie went gold and amber, and the mornings were sharp and clear, and she still came to see Juniper most mornings, but now she did it from 20 feet away, stepping out the front door in her boots and coat, and then back in for a cup of coffee that they drank together before the day began. It was domestic in a way that he had not expected to want and did want, deeply, the way you want something that turns out to fit the exact shape of a space you'd been carrying around without realizing it was empty. She drove him to distraction regularly, and he did the same to her, and they were both well aware of this, and considered it a feature rather than a problem. The thing that happened in November was the land deed. A man arrived in Caldwell from a county real estate office in Wichita, with documentation claiming that there was a discrepancy in the original deed to Elias' property, the livery, and the adjoining land, that suggested the eastern boundary was 12 feet further into his property than he'd been claiming, which would mean that the corner of his stable was, technically, sitting on land he didn't own. It was the kind of legal complication that could be serious or could be nothing, depending on who owned the land in question and what they wanted to do about it. And in this case, the land in question had been purchased 6 months prior by Herbert Colton, whose water diversion project had been stalled but whose interest in acquiring useful town property had not. Winifred found out about it at school, because in Caldwell information moved through the children faster than through any other channel, and she came home that evening with the particular set of her jaw that meant she'd already started thinking. "He bought the land in June," she said, before Elias had finished washing his hands. Before the deeds office confirmed the discrepancy, which means he knew about the discrepancy before we did. Elias considered this. "You think he engineered it? I think it is deeply convenient." She sat down at the table and pulled out the legal paper the land agent had left and spread it out. "What do your original deed papers say?" He produced them from the strongbox under the bed. They sat together at the table with the east window, the lamp lit because the evenings were dark now, and went through the documents page by page. Her mind was faster than his on the legal language, but his knowledge of the physical property was more precise, and between them they found what they were looking for. The original survey, dating to 1870, used a post at the northeast corner of the property as its reference point. The post was still there. Elias knew exactly where it was, and if the measurements in the original survey were measured from that post, the eastern boundary landed where he'd always believed it was. "The discrepancy," Winifred said slowly, "is in a resurvey done in 1876, which uses a different reference point." She looked up, and the 1876 resurvey was filed by, she squinted at the document, filed by H.A. Colton. They looked at each other. "He filed a fraudulent resurvey 3 years ago," Elias said. "In case he ever needed it," she said, "a piece ready to use." He was quiet for a moment, managing the anger that was there and needed managing. "We need a lawyer. We need the original surveyor," she said. "If he's still living and can testify to his original markers, the resurvey is invalid." They spent 2 evenings writing letters, one to the county land office in Wichita, one to the state surveyor's office in Topeka, one to a lawyer in Wichita whose name the school board chairman had given Elias the previous year in a different context. Winifred wrote the legal letter and Elias wrote the practical ones, and she reviewed his for accuracy and he reviewed hers for tone, and the combination was, they agreed, better than either alone. The reply from Topeka came in the 2nd week of December. The original surveyor, a man named Clement Hall, was still living and practicing in Dodge City, and yes, the survey in question was his, and he had his original field notes. He agreed to send a sworn affidavit. He also noted, in a postscript that Winifred read aloud with visible delight, that he'd been suspicious of that 1876 resurvey when he'd heard about it, and would be glad to see the matter resolved. The affidavit arrived before Christmas, and the county land office accepted it as superseding the 1876 document, and Herbert Colton's claim on the eastern 12 feet of Elias' property was nullified. The mayor did not speak to either of them for 2 weeks afterward, and then at a December town meeting gave them a terse nod that was as close to acknowledgement as he was capable of, and Winifred received it with grave, composed courtesy that Elias recognized as the purest form of her particular triumph. "You won," he said afterward, walking home. "We won," she said. "No," he said. "You won. The letter to Topeka was your idea. The affidavit strategy was yours. I provided the original deed papers." She considered this. "That is an accurate accounting." "I know," he said. "I've been practicing." She laughed, the real one, the cold December air turning her breath to vapor, and took his arm as they walked. Christmas was quiet and good. They had people for dinner, Nell Harper and the surveyor, whose name was Thomas Ashe and who was lonely at the holidays, and the widow Calloway and her children, because Winifred had invited them, and it was correct to do so. And the children were noisy and cheerful, and Walter herded them benevolently, and Cornet and Juniper were given extra hay, and stood together in the paddock in the cold in the way that horses stand, shoulder to shoulder. Which Winifred said was affection and Elias said was warmth management, and she said that was not mutually exclusive, and he said she was right. She was right. The new year came with snow, which was not unusual for Kansas in January, and with the snows came the quiet rhythms of a winter town. Things slowed. The cattle drives were done until spring, and the livery work was steadier but less various. He had time that winter he hadn't had before, and he spent a portion of it reading the books she handed him, one after another, with the expectation that he'd have opinions about them, and he did. And the arguments that followed about literature were some of his favorite arguments because they had no stakes except the pleasure of the thing. In February, she told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning before school, with the east window light behind her and Juniper's soft sound from the paddock in the background. And she said it simply and directly because that was how she said things, and then watched his face. He stood up from where he'd been sitting and crossed to her and held her with both arms, and he didn't say anything for a moment because he was feeling several things at once and he was managing them. And then he said into the top of her head, "Winifred." "Yes," she said against his chest. "Are you?" He pulled back enough to see her face. "How are you?" "Entirely well," she said, and he could see it, she was steady and clear-eyed, the way she was with everything she'd decided how to approach. A little tired in the mornings, very certain. "Of what?" She looked up at him. "Of everything," she said. "Of this." He kissed her forehead. He sat back down and she sat across from him, and they talked about it the way they talked about everything, practically. Honestly, going through what needed to be thought through, and also not practically, also in the way that two people talk when something beautiful and large has arrived and needs room to be what it is. She kept teaching through the spring, which the school board attempted to make complicated again, and which she handled with the specific efficiency she applied to all board complications, producing written precedent and the county superintendent's letter again, and the board backed down again. The children of Caldwell were attached to her and she to them, and the school board eventually arrived at the position that attached teachers who produce results are worth accommodating, which was the position they should have started from. He built the cradle himself, in the evenings in the tack room after the day's work was done, with wood from a walnut tree that had come down on Pruett's ranch in the winter storm and which Pruett had given him at a fair price. He was meticulous about it. She came and watched some evenings, sitting on the old stool with her hands folded in her lap, and she did not offer opinions, which was how he knew she trusted him with it, and the not offering of opinions was its own kind of gift. "It's going to be beautiful," she said, one evening in April when it was nearly done. "I haven't finished the rockers," he said. "I can still tell." She ran her hand along the smooth side. "You're careful when you care about something." He looked at her over the work. "Is that a compliment or an observation?" "Both," she said. The child was born in the last week of June, 1880, in the good room of their house on a Thursday morning when the prairie was full of summer and the heat was coming up clean and the meadowlarks were going at it outside the window. Nell Harper was there, and the doctor from Caldwell, a competent man named Dr. Pryor, and Winifred labored with the same focused intensity she brought to everything that mattered to her. And when it was done, she was exhausted and very much herself, and the child was a boy. Elias stood in the room with his son in his arms, a small, serious-faced boy who looked at him with the ancient squinting scrutiny of all new people encountering the world. And he was so full of feeling that he could not speak for a moment, which happened to him sometimes. And Winifred watched him from the bed with her hair loose and her eyes tired and bright and said, softly, "What are you thinking?" He looked at her. "I'm thinking that I made a long list of things I wanted in a life, and this is better than the list." "The list was under-ambitious," she said, and smiled at him, slow and warm. "It was," he agreed. "I've been corrected on that." "By whom?" "By the variables I didn't account for," he said, looking at her, and she understood, and the smile became something brighter and quieter all at once. They named the boy Samuel after her grandfather, which she'd asked for and he'd agreed to with genuine enthusiasm because Samuel was a name with weight to it, the kind that grew into its owner. Samuel Thatcher. He tried it out several times in his head before he said it aloud, and when he did she said, "That's the name." "That's the name," he confirmed. Samuel was a calm baby, as it turned out, which Dr. Pryor said was either nature or the fact that he had been born into a household with good rhythms, and Elias thought it was probably both. He slept and woke and fed and regarded the world with a kind of even attention that Elias recognized in himself, and looked at the world with a kind of focused curiosity that was entirely Winifred's. Walter accepted Samuel immediately and completely, which said something about Walter's character. He positioned himself near the cradle with the seriousness of a dog who has been given a new and important responsibility, which none of them had asked him to do, and all of them were glad he had. The summer of 1880 moved through its weeks the way good summers do, fully, without rushing, each day offering its particular thing. Samuel grew the way babies grow, which is the most ordinary miracle there is. Winifred returned to teaching in September with Samuel at 4 months old, an arrangement she'd worked out with Nell Harper to care for him during school hours, which Nell was glad to do because Nell had decided Samuel was the finest baby she'd encountered in 20 years, and this was not a mild opinion. Elias expanded the livery. He'd been thinking about it for 2 years, and this fall he did it, added 4 more stalls on the north side and a proper grain storage building adjacent to it. He hired a young hand named Peter Lark, 17 years old and farm-raised, who was good with horses and showed up every morning without being told to, which was the main qualification. He paid Peter fairly, which Peter was grateful for, and which Elias told him was just right practice. You pay a man what the work is worth. Winifred had opinions about the expansion, and most of them were correct, which he told her, and she had the grace to be modest about it, which she sometimes was when she wasn't expecting to be right about something structural. The autumn brought small things and large ones, the way autumns do. There was the matter of a family that arrived in Caldwell in October, a husband and wife named the Ashfords, with 3 children, who'd come west looking for land and found instead that the good land near Caldwell was largely claimed. They were not destitute, but they were in the particular difficulty of people who have used most of their resources to get somewhere and are now uncertain what to do next. Winifred met the Ashford children on a Monday, and by Tuesday she'd spoken to the widow Calloway, who had more land than she could work alone, and by Thursday there was an agreement in place for the Ashfords to help work the Calloway land through the winter in exchange for housing in the Calloway's outbuilding, and in the spring they'd look at a formal arrangement. Elias had heard about this in pieces through the week, and when the arrangement was complete she told him the whole of it over dinner, efficiently and without drama, and he listened and then said, "You built that in 4 days. The pieces were there," she said. "I just arranged them. That's what building is," he said. She looked at him across the table, and Samuel was asleep in the room behind them, and Walter was by the stove, and outside the October prairie was doing what the October prairie did, and she said, "I think Caldwell is home." "You didn't think so before?" He asked it genuinely. "I hoped it would be," she said. "Now I know it is." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. He had large hands and she had useful hands, and they fit together without any adjustment required, which he had thought about before and thought about now. "Good," he said. She turned her hand over and held his. "You were right about one thing, that first argument." "Only one," he said. "One relevant thing." "You said I was doing fine on my own." She looked at him. I could have gone on doing fine." A pause. "Fine is a different thing from this." "Yes," he said. "I'd rather have this," she said. "So would I," he said, "by a significant margin." In the spring of 1881, the town of Caldwell incorporated formally and elected a new town council that included, for the first time, a seat explicitly for educational affairs, and the woman nominated to serve in that capacity by a wide margin of the townsfolk who showed up to vote was Winifred Thatcher, who accepted the position on the condition that she retained her teaching role, a condition the new council agreed to in about 30 seconds. Herbert Colton did not run for re-election as mayor and moved his operations to Wichita, which the town noted without particular sorrow. The new mayor was a man named George Ellison, who had been running the hardware store for 11 years and was considered honest and practical, both of which turned out to be accurate. Elias and Winifred went to the council's first official meeting together, sitting side by side, and she took her seat at the front table with the other members and he sat in the third row, and he watched her across the room and thought about the April morning 2 years before when she'd walked into his stable with her paint mare and her leather satchel and her hand extended for a shake. He'd built a life around this woman. Not for her, she would never have wanted that, and he knew it, but alongside her. With her. The distinction mattered enormously to both of them, and they had talked about it once, early on, and then didn't need to talk about it again, because it was simply how things were built between them. Walter was getting older, though he remained vigorous and opinionated, and he had taken to sleeping in Samuel's room, having apparently transferred his most serious protective instincts to the child. Samuel, now almost a year old, had become a dedicated crawler and was beginning to show signs of walking, which Walter accompanied with an attendance so devoted that Samuel used the dog as a support structure for his early standing experiments, which Walter bore with the patience of a saint. Winifred watched this one evening from the doorway and said, "Walter is better with children than most people. Walter is better with most things than most people," Elias said. "Should we tell him?" "I think he knows," Elias said. She came to stand beside him in the doorway, watching their son steady himself against the ancient dog, and she leaned against Elias with the easy familiarity of two people who have shared the same space long enough to know exactly how they fit together, and he put his arm around her, and they stood there for a while in the particular quiet of a good evening in a house where good things had gathered. In the summer of 1881 she told him she was expecting again, which she did on a Saturday morning on the livery fence where they'd first had a real conversation, which he thought was her being deliberate about and which she confirmed when he mentioned it. "I wanted to tell you here," she said. "Because of the fence," he said. "Because of everything," she said, and gestured at the paddock, the stable, the house behind the property, the town beyond. "This is where it started." He looked around at it, the livery that was larger than when she'd arrived, the good fence, the house that had become theirs, the sound of Samuel inside with Nell Harper who was minding him for the morning, Walter's familiar shape in the paddock being inspected with curious nosiness by Juniper and Cornet both. 2 years. More than 2 years, and each one had built on the one before in the way that honest effort builds. "How are you feeling?" he asked her. "Certain," she said. "As before." "Good," he said. "You're not going to tell me to rest more." He considered this carefully, because this was the kind of question that had a right and wrong answer, and he knew exactly what both of them were. "No," he said. "I'm going to ask you how you're doing and trust what you tell me." She looked at him. Then she nodded very slightly in a way that meant she'd been testing something and found what she expected. "Elias," she said. "Yes. You know what I've realized. Tell me." She turned to look at him on the fence, the morning light on her face, and she said, "I realized sometime last year that you used to let me win arguments on purpose, early on. And then I realized that even after you admitted it, even after you stopped, I realized you'd never been doing it because you thought I couldn't handle the truth. You'd been doing it because she stopped. Because watching someone be right about something matters to you, not just with me, with people generally. You want people to be right and be seen to be right." He looked at her. "But with me it was different," she said, "because it was me specifically." He said quietly, "Yes. You loved watching me win," she said. "I did," he said. "I do." He met her eyes. "I love watching you be entirely yourself, whatever form that takes." She was quiet for a moment, and the brightness was there, the real one, the fullest version, the one he'd been cataloging since that April morning and would, he expected, spend the rest of his life being glad about. "We should probably go inside," she said. "Samuel will have Nell tired out by now." "Probably," he agreed. Neither of them moved for another minute. The second child was a girl, born in the early spring of 1882, On a March morning when the Kansas sky was doing the thing it does in early spring, enormous and pale and full of the specific quality of a season that is arriving, not yet arrived, but coming with conviction. She was louder than Samuel had been from the first moment, which felt right, and she looked at the world with an expression of energetic assessment that made Dr. Pryor say he had an idea this one would keep them busy. They named her Clara, after Elias' mother, which he'd suggested quietly one evening, and Winifred had said yes immediately, which was the kind of agreement that doesn't need any more words around it. Clara Margaret Thatcher, the Margaret was for his mother's middle name, which Winifred had asked about specifically because she wanted the name to be full. Samuel met Clara with the measured seriousness of a nearly 2-year-old who has been told something large is happening and is working through the implications. He looked at her for a long time and then looked at Elias with an expression that suggested he was reserving judgment. And then over the following weeks, he transferred to Clara the same watchful attention he gave everything he was uncertain about. And by the end of the first month, he decided she was acceptable. Walter had no reservations whatsoever and installed himself immediately in the double duty of minding both children, which he managed with what could only be called dignity. The spring of 1882 in Caldwell was busy with all the usual things. The cattle season beginning again, the trail herds coming through, the town adjusting to its new formal council, and the various small and large decisions that went with a growing place. Winifred was on the council and teaching and managing 2 children and a household, and she was, Elias thought regularly, the most competent person he knew, which he told her sometimes, and which she received with the particular pleasure of a woman who is used to working hard and glad to have it noticed. He said to her once in an ordinary evening after both children were asleep and the house was in the good quiet that lives at the end of full days, "I think you are the most capable person in Caldwell." She looked up from the book she was reading. "You're exaggerating." "I'm not. I've been thinking about it for a while and I've assessed it accurately." She considered him. "You've run an accurate assessment." "I have," he said. "I work with facts." She smiled and went back to her book, but she was still smiling several minutes later, and he saw it, and that was enough. That was exactly what he had hoped for. They argued throughout all of it, about real things and small things, and he won sometimes and she won sometimes, and the ratio remained as she had tracked, roughly even, which meant it was honest, which meant it was right. He stopped a habit of letting her win on purpose sometime that first spring, when he told her, but occasionally, not often but occasionally, when the argument was very small and the thing was genuinely close, and she made her case with that focused brightness. He thought about where all of this had started and he felt something settle warm and permanent in his chest, and he let it go. Not because he was managing her, not because he thought she needed the win, but because some things are worth giving freely, and he knew the difference now between the giving that comes from love and the giving that comes from fear. He had done the first kind from the beginning. He understood now, even when he'd thought he was doing the second. He'd loved her from so early that the manufacturing had been love all along, just love that hadn't found its name yet. He told her this one autumn evening, almost 3 years after the first argument about the water rights, sitting on the livery fence in the last of the evening light while Samuel chased fireflies in the paddock and Clara sat in Winifred's lap studying a button with the complete concentration that small children bring to objects. "I think I was in love with you before I knew I was letting you win," he said. She looked at him sideways. "I know. You knew. I could tell." She touched the button to Clara's cheek to make her smile. "I couldn't tell about myself for a while. I wasn't looking for it." "I know," he said, "but I found it anyway," she said and looked at him. "Apparently some things don't wait for you to be ready for them." "No," he agreed. "They just show up and wait in the stable until you notice." She laughed. Clara grabbed the button and made a pleased noise. Samuel caught a firefly in his cupped hands and brought it carefully to his father to look at before releasing it into the dusk, and Elias watched it spiral away into the warm evening air over the Kansas prairie that went on and on to the west, enormous and free. The same prairie it had always been, patient as anything that has always been there. And the firefly went out and came back on somewhere in the grass, and the children's voices were in the air, and Winifred's shoulder was against his, and the horses were quiet in the paddock behind them. He thought about the April morning nearly 4 years ago when she'd walked in with her paint mare and her satchel and her hand held out to shake. And he thought about the first argument and the first win, and the look on her face that he'd spent weeks manufacturing small moments to see, and which he'd been seeing ever since. The real version, the honest version, in all the daily ways that living with a person gives you, the brightness that meant she was entirely herself and knew it. He had let her win an argument on purpose long ago, and then realized he'd been doing it for weeks, and then admitted to himself exactly why, and then eventually told her, and the whole complicated, honest road from there to here had been, what was the word? He tried it out in his head. Not lucky, not accidental, accumulated, built. One honest thing laid upon another until what you had was something true enough to stand on. He put his arm around her and she leaned into it, and Clara dropped the button in the grass and complained, and Winifred leaned forward to find it in the fading light, and Samuel came back for another firefly, and Walter arrived from the house with his particular stately trot to see what was happening in the paddock and whether it required his supervision. It was a good evening. It was a good life. And somewhere in the warm September dark of Caldwell, Kansas, 1882, with the cattle trails being history and the town still becoming what it would be and the prairie doing what it always did, it was all exactly what it was supposed to be, which was the thing that Elias Thatcher had stopped believing was possible somewhere around the time he was 20, and started believing again the morning a woman shook his hand and said his name like she'd already decided he was worth knowing. She had been right about that. He was fairly sure he would not argue with her about it, and the reason, the only reason, the honest reason was that she was entirely correct.